Hello friends old and new, my name is Stian and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at this beautiful triple date Omega Speedmaster automatic. First thing we always do when we get a watch on the bench is to check the functions. We see the quick set date works, month switches over when it should, time setting works. See the GMT hand also follows as it should. And the quick set pusher at 10 o'clock for the weekday also works nicely. Alright, let's put it on the time grapher. Houston, we have a problem. I'm not sure what kind of problem, but there is a problem. It's really difficult to see from this readout what's going on here, but something is going on. So it's about time to open the case. And the automatic version of the Speedmaster typically has a snap-on case back. So we'll just pry it open. And there we have it. The Omega 1151. Also known as the Valjoux 7751, because it's pretty much the same movement. For those of you who saw the Eberhardt video, we'll be referring back to the stock movement a little bit here and there. What we can already see, of course, is that the movement is quite nicely finished. And honestly, that is the main difference. Alright, so there's a lot of hands to take off. This watch has 8 hands. So that should be enough for anyone who likes to be a little bit handsy. Oh man, that's the lamest joke I've heard on the internet for a while. Anyway, there are a lot of tools, various tools to take off the hands. I like to use these hand levers with a piece of plastic to protect the dial. Most important thing is that we don't leave marks on the dial. You see the dial is in very nice condition, so we want to leave it that way. So we put it in this little box that will protect it nicely. We have this special movement holder for the 7750 family. It's actually very useful. We'll get to that a little bit later, the main uses of it, but when working on the date side of the watch, very useful. So we'll put the date and weekday discs in the box also, for safekeeping. So I think Omega as a brand probably doesn't need a long introduction. But maybe we talk a little bit about the Speedmaster and the Speedmaster automatic or reduced. So in the Le Mania video, we talked quite a bit about how the different movement makers were competing and how the whole quartz crisis things impacted things. And the Speedmaster was initially introduced as a sort of racing sports watch, hence the word speed. But the most famous use for it nowadays is of course as the Moon Watch. It was the first watch approved for use by the US space program for the Gemini and Apollo programs, beating out Rolex and Longines in the process. And of course being one of only 2 watches on the moon, as far as I know. The other being a Bulova. Interestingly, a UMF Rula watch was also in space, although not quite on the moon. So while we've been discussing this, or rather me talking about this. We've stripped most of the calendar functions, and we're down to this actual cannon pinion. A bit tricky to get off, and if you use hand levers like I did here, it's very important to make sure that the wheel stays as horizontal as possible, otherwise you might damage the pivot. And pop quiz: did any viewers see any difference on the calendar side between this movement and the stock 7751 movement? Let us know in the comment below. On the train side of things, we're also not going to see a lot of differences. Darn it! I gave away the answer. The main thing we see is that the finishing is of course nicer than a stock movement, and it has a metal brake, but that's pretty much it, to be honest. One other small difference: this intermediate minute counter wheel has a ruby pivot hole, but there really isn't too many differences. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I suppose the answer really depends on the value you get. The Speedmaster automatic, this 888 version, they do stay very well in price or in value, even though the movement is pretty much stock 7751, just finished a bit nicer. And we of course do know that the finishing is actually very expensive. It's a lot of manual labor that costs a lot. Ref the Valjoux video. And do you have any reason to feel disappointed if you buy an Omega Speedmaster automatic for, let's say, 2,000 euros or dollars, when it has a movement that costs maybe $300-400 to big buyers like Omega? Yeah, I'm not gonna answer the question. It's something every person has to answer for themselves, I think. So we've gotten down to the base movement now. We're checking the end shakes and side shakes. You see this movement is more jeweled than the Eberhardt one we looked at. Still has the same layout, of course. And the reason we're taking off the different parts and holding them for a second or so is to inspect them. So looking at the pivots, looking at the teeth very quickly. Most important thing is the pivots. So let's also take off the keyless works. We're gonna put a couple of these screws back in, just so we don't mix them up with others. It's actually a good habit to put the screws back in if you're working on movements that you don't know so well. Let's get the shock settings out. Alright. We also took out the mainspring. The barrel looks a little bit worn, but that's pretty much exaggerated by the lighting. because actually looking at it, it's okay. Alright, everything separated into parts. Now let's get the super glue and the duct tape and a healthy dose of black magic. Then maybe we can get this thing running again. Worth noting, there are still a couple of plastic parts. Most notably this hour counter brake. And there we go. Off to the cleaners.
Working at the car wash. Working at the car wash, yeah. Ooh. Working at the car wash. Working at the car wash, yeah.
So, with 33 minutes on our hands, let's spend it wisely. We're gonna clean the pushers. So we're gonna take those out of the case. Gonna run the case and the case pack and the pushers and all those things through the ultrasonic. And then we'll start reassembling the movement when we get back from the cleaner. Alright, so we got all the stuff back in one big jumble from the cleaning machine. We see some gray-haired dude is blocking up the camera. And no, that was not nose hair. What kind of sick, twisted mind would think about nose hair, man? Seriously. Anyway, while this old-looking gray-haired dude works on the watch, we can continue our discussion a little bit. We're talking about the Moon Watch, so the Speedmaster Professional. This Speedmaster is not the Moon Watch. And here we come back to that discussion about Le Mania versus other movements. So the high-end Le Mania, being more complicated to make, more costly, was only used in the Speedmaster Professional. Whereas the Speedmaster Automatic line typically uses the 7750. Although it was actually initially introduced in 1987 with an in-house Omega/Le Mania movement. But no one knows about that, so if you talk about Speedmaster Automatic, you're pretty much going to find either the 7750 versions, or, and this is actually a pretty important thing if you're looking at buying one of these, one with a module on top of a 2892 movement. So first of all, if you're looking at buying an Omega Speedmaster, of course what we discussed already is that the main difference is between the professional and the automatic versions. And now I'm talking about older watches, because nowadays Omega discontinued the use of 7750s, that kind of models, and they now have an Omega Professional Automatic with their newer in-house movements. But for vintage sake, or let's say typically these watches would be from the late 90s, maybe 2000 and so forth. For those watches, the main difference is between the professional and the automatics, and then within the automatics you have between the 7750 family and the modules. Man, that was a long one. Did I just say things like twice? I think that gray hair is getting into the brain somehow. Anyway, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So here a picture of a very popular version of the automatic Speedmaster. This is the Schumacher version. Also comes in red. And this one has the module. And what's confusing here is that the layout of the subdials is the same as on the professional. Whereas we might know that the 7750 has 3 registers on 6, 9 and 12 o'clock. But there is a different way to see if it has a module. If you look at the side photo, you see that the pushers are actually not aligned with the crown. And that's because the chronograph module is then placed on top of the 2892 movement. So don't get confused if you're looking to buy one of these. There's a massive difference in the value and price between the professional and the automatic versions. Ah, it's a lovely day in Switzerland. Hear the birds chirping. Birds chirper. Skirper dirper. Super burger. Swedish chef. Chocolate mousse. Skirper skirp. Note to self, edit that part out. I was saying, or trying to say, that it's a nice day in Switzerland. Birds chirping outside the window. It's a nice companion. So we're already quite far along with reassembling the keyless works. For the various posts, we use HP 1300 or D5 similar. And where the metal parts rub against each other with high pressure, we use grease. In general, I always use the blue oiler. You can also use the black/red one. They're the same size, just different color for some reason. But they're very tiny, so you don't always get enough oil. Let's just get this cover plate / setting lever spring on first. So for the amount of oil and grease, it should be very little. Less than you think typically. And if you do use too much, you can rub it off with Rodico. What we're gonna do is first assemble the base movement and make it run well, because you might remember that it didn't. And the birds are really chirping. It's very nice. You know, watchmakers aren't only these hulky macho men that you think they are. We also can appreciate the small things in life. Between bending iron bars and lifting cars. Speaking of which, I'm moving houses here in Switzerland. And I really got a reminder that being used to lifting parts that weigh maybe 2 microgram is slightly different than from lifting boxes that weigh like 70 kilos. Muscle ache, baby. Muscle ache. Alright, let's give it a good wind. We'll oil the pivots. You see the balance is already oscillating. And let's put this watch movement on the time grapher. See where we get. And that doesn't look too good. So there are a few things we can see here. Most important is that the amplitude is too high, which often is a sign that the hairspring coils are touching each other. So that's the first thing we're going to have a look at, see if that's the case. And the second is that there seems to be some kind of cyclical event going on. So we're going to use the Etachron tool, because this movement has the Etachron regulation system. We're going to use this little tool we see here that fits on top of both the stud holder and the index. And one thing you might have noticed is that the hairspring doesn't develop very evenly. So it's developing much more on one side than the other. I had to do this regulation in a few different increments, but what I'm basically doing is to rotate the stud holder a little bit, and that way you can make the hairspring sort of start out wide or narrow, so it develops more outwards or inwards, if that makes it possible to understand. And then we can also regulate the index to make sure that the hairspring has just enough space on each side to breathe, but that it doesn't get stuck between the index pins, and also that it doesn't have too much space. If the hairspring is touching the index pins all the time, then the watch is going to run too fast, and regulating it will not do anything other than potentially jumbling up the hairspring when you try to move the index. And if there's too much space, then you're going to get a lot of positional differences in timekeeping. Alright, so with those adjustments done, we see the watch runs quite well. Only thing we're going to do is make it run ever so slightly fast instead of ever so slightly slow. I mean, imagine you told your wife that you're going to be home at a certain time, and then you're 3 seconds late. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes, buddy. So that's why we set the watch a little bit fast. Alright, with the base movement healthy, we can turn our attention to the chronograph parts. And there are a lot of them. Now, there are multiple ways to skin a cat, and yes, we had this discussion before. We're using either Molykote DX or Mobius 9504 for these high pressure chronograph parts. So like the cam, and you can either put the grease on while it's in situ, so in place, or you can do it before like we did now. So we can put on the chronograph bridge. We need to make sure that this reset pusher is out of the way. And also remember that this screw for the barrel arbor needs to be the correct one, because it has a pretty low head profile. And quite a few of these parts can be tricky to place, and that's why we use editing software. But also when you've done it a few times, it's of course easier. That's the famous learning curve kicking in. I spent all night yesterday assembling this combined bed and wardrobe furniture for my son. Not IKEA, but something similar, flat packed. And you get a great impression of the learning curve when you assemble like 10 of those drawers. It's like the first one takes quite a long time, fiddling and going back and forth and looking at those freaking instructions and that you of course threw away in the first place. But then it gets smoother and faster. But perhaps a more important curve is the swear curve. It's very similar. You start out cursing and what the and then you go down to after a few. And this little spring under the chronograph wheel is also subject to quite a lot of cursing sometimes. Very pingable little part. And when it comes to pinging parts, or rather avoiding pinging parts, the most important thing is to hold the parts very loosely with your tweezer, not squeeze them too tight. Because it's when you squeeze tight with the tweezers that you really send things across the room. So one criticism that's sometimes laid upon the 7750 family is that these parts sort of float on top of each other. And that is true, of course. It's not as bad as in the module that we'll hopefully be able to have a look at later for the Schumacher version. But it's not the most elegant. But it keeps the watch cheap. Well, if you can talk even now, Omega Speedmaster automatic is cheap. But let's say it keeps the costs down and probably the profits high for the manufacturer. And I was kind of thinking I had some benefit to the buyer that I could tell at the end of that, but I'm not really sure now. Anyway, we got the automatic bridge back on as well. That can be a pain in the gluteus maximus area. But you know the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, curse, blame someone else, curse more, blame a third person, then go for a walk, and then yeah, try again. These springs can also be a bit tricky to get on, and whenever you see a little eye in a piece like that, it is to help you grab it with a pair of tweezers. Alright, we can start the chronograph, see if everything runs. And there are a couple of things we're looking for here. First, in the upper right corner is the interaction between the oscillating pinion and the chronograph wheel. We'll look at the depthing. And on the left side, just now, we see that this little finger is coming to tip the intermediate minute counter wheel over. And that little finger should first move the wheel, and then the second part of it should not move the wheel. So you might have to adjust that little finger / spring a little bit. This one looked good. Then we're going to put in a little bit of oil to lubricate a few of these pinions as well, before we can turn back to the calendar side. And I mentioned before that this smallest oiler does come in handy a couple of places. Most notably this actual cannon pinion has this friction spring underneath, where no other oiler gets in, so you need to use the smallest one. And the same thing for the hour counter wheel. And when we press this cannon pinion down, we need to make sure it meshes nicely. Basically that it's at the same height as the wheel. And then we're going to run it back and forth a little bit just to make sure that the oil spreads. So the hour counter wheel actually needs to be lubricated in 4 different places. So one is the bottom pivot. The second is the friction spring at the bottom. The third is in between the 2 parts of it. And the last one is on the heart-shaped cam. And again, for this friction spring underneath, the smallest oiler again comes in handy. So it's not always good to have the biggest thing. And for those of you who got some, let's say, impure thoughts from that, shame on you. I just meant biggest oiler. In that regard, there's a pretty funny board game, or party game perhaps, called the Dirty Mind. An example of the questions is a 4-letter word for women, and the last 3 are UNT. Obviously that word is aunt, but I'm sure that was the word on everyone's mind. For the hour counter setup with the brake and the hammer, there are a couple of things to watch out for, and it's very advisable to use a probe when you're trying to put that curved spring back, especially when you're gonna grease it. I think in my videos I don't use the probe enough. I'm a little bit too used to using tweezers. But it's definitely better to use a probe one time too many than too few. Sitting on your knees trying to find the 1 millimeter big part in a 4 centimeter tall carpet is less than ideal. For this calendar driving wheel, we need to make sure we leave the space, the cutout there, for the date wheel. The date wheel has a little finger as well that flicks over the month every 31 times it rotates. So then you can guess the number of teeth on it. What that also means is that if you want to change the sequencing between when a date changes and a weekday, then you can simply move that date wheel a little bit, so the finger comes in before or after the finger on the weekday wheel. One other difference in this movement from the Eberhardt is that the Eberhardt, as you might remember, had all the parts for the moon phase, apart from the moon phase wheel itself. In this movement, those parts are taken out. Or maybe someone didn't put them back in a previous service. Putting on a little bit more HP 1300 on all these different jumper posts. Quite a few of them. And then we have these 2 cover plates that we need to put on. One important thing when we're dealing with these tiny yellow screwdriver screws is to make sure that our screwdriver has the right size. And I don't mean yellow or red. I mean that the head is sharpened and wide enough so that it doesn't slip. You will get some very unsightly scratches on these plates if you do. With those in place, we can put on the wheels, or discs rather. One little thing here is that there's a star wheel on the underside of each disc, and the jumper of course interacts with the actual star wheel, and the star wheel is friction fit onto the disc. So what you might come across is that the lettering is misaligned to the apertures, the windows, if you will, in the dial. And if you do come across that, you simply have to move the star wheel a little bit to align the lettering. Now, I mentioned before in the video that this type of movement holder is very handy. And the key reason for that is when you put the hands back on. Aligning the chronograph hands is a really ungrateful task, but it's much easier if you can keep the hammer pressed on towards the hard cams while you're doing it. And that's what you can do with this kind of movement holder. You just keep the button depressed, and then you can more easily align the chronograph hands. It's still a little bit of a pain in the ass, but it makes it easier. And the other great advantage with this movement holder is that it has built-in support on the underside of the chronograph seconds pivot, so that when you press the hand on, it actually has something to press against. And that is both safer and better. You don't risk pressing anything out of the jewel hole, and you can actually press the hand on properly. Alright, so we got the date hand on. We're going to flip it through so we get to midnight. Then we can place the hour hand at midnight. It is kind of funny when you know how it works, but every now and then I get questions from people saying that, oh, the date doesn't change at midnight. Could you check with similar models if it's something wrong with the one I have? Alright, as we're getting to a conclusion for this watch, it has been a while since I uploaded the video. I've had more pressing matters to attend to, perhaps best illustrated by this conversation.
8 days is my birthday.
Yeah. Then you're
No, in
5.
1 day. And after 8 days is 7 days until my birthday. And after 7 days is 6 days until my birthday. And after 6 days is
500 days.
5 days until my birthday. And after 5 days is my birthday is 4 days until my birthday. And after 4 days is my birthday is 3 days is my birthday. And after this is my birthday is 2 days is my birthday.
Yeah.
And after 1 day is my birthday.
And after your birthday is 365 days.
So after trying to teach the concept of number of days in the years to my soon-to-be 5-year-old, we're back to getting the last few hands on the watch. And that looks alright. Test again with a GMT hand, see that it lines up nicely. And we can put on the running seconds hand. And the movement has a hack, so the running seconds hand is not going to start running, and also not the chronograph, unless we press the ground in. Yeah, there we go. We're using the same trick for all the chronograph hands. We're holding the reset pusher in while we press the hands down. That makes it a little bit easier. Still have to try a couple of times typically. But in the end, we're pretty happy. Then we're going to start the chronograph, let it run for a while. So now it's 18 minutes later. We see that the minute counter and the hour counter have moved. We're going to stop the seconds hand at pretty much 30. That's where the heart cam is on the flattest. So if it flicks over properly there and resets to 0, then that should happen everywhere. So 30 seconds is the best place to do that. We got the clean case and pushers and everything back. Gonna reassemble that as well. Works smoothly. And before we case the movement, we make sure to clean the inside of the crystal. It's very annoying if you have some lint on the inside. Let's take this non-original crown out. So due to my daughter's birthday, there were a few days in between these tapings actually. So the watch had wound down in the meantime, so I had to wind it again. So we can put in the case screws. Gonna oil the rotor post a little bit. And I mentioned this in the Eberhard video as well, but this screw that locks down the rotor, very important to get that right. It has this little dimple or recess at the end, where the lower pivot of a chronograph wheel fits in, so it doesn't break. Using the wrong screw will break it, so be very careful with that. For the ball bearing in the rotor, we're going to use a little bit of Lubetta V106 to lubricate it. Of course, the 7750 family is famous for this spinning rotor. You can feel if it's a 7750 family inside the movement just by lifting it up and down a little bit fast. Finally, the case back. We're going to put in a new gasket. And we're going to use a similar red gasket just to stay in style. As you have probably noticed, we're not going to do anything with the case for this watch. It is in very fine condition, and it seems to not have been polished, so we're not going to break the seal on that one. What we are going to do, however, is find a bracelet for it. We got the watch, just the watch head itself. But it's kind of impractical walking around with just the watch head, so we got this original bracelet for it. So let's put it on and get the watch on the wrist. First though, let's have a look at what's up next on the channel. We're gonna look at the Zenith Surf, where we need to relume the hands. Alright, there we have it. I really like the Speedmaster automatic. I think the size is perfect. And with the original bracelet, it looks pretty strapping. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please click like and subscribe. That will really help the channel. So would appreciate that. We'll be back shortly. Until then, ta-ta.